The saloon lights flickered like dying stars, dim and uncertain, painting shadows across the dust-streaked floor. The smell of whiskey, smoke and sweat hung thick in the air, heavy like the ache that followed every lonely night in Redstone. Behind the bar, Clara Mae Hollis wiped a glass that was already clean, her mind far away from the piano tune that struggled to stay in tune. Redstone was a town built on broken promises. Every corner held a man running from something, every woman pretending she wasn't waiting for someone to come back. Clara had stopped pretending long ago. Love, she told herself, was a thing best left to the foolish. It burned like the whiskey she poured and left the same scars. She wore a faded blue dress that had seen too many nights, her once bright hair pinned up in a way that said she didn't care, but she always did. Her heart still remembered the way it used to race when the door swung open, the way her fingers trembled, hoping it might be someone she'd lost to the desert years ago. But tonight was different. Tonight the air shifted. The door opened slow, like the wind itself hesitated. A man stepped through, tall and rough-edged, with the kind of silence that spoke louder than most men's words. His coat carried dust from long roads, his face half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. One look, and Clara knew he wasn't just another drifter. He walked like he'd seen too much and lost even more. He leaned against the bar without asking for attention, his eyes tracing the shelves of amber bottles behind her. His voice was low when it finally broke the silence, soft but worn like gravel under rain. Whiskey, neat. Clara poured without a word. The way his fingers brushed the glass sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. She didn't believe in first impressions anymore, but something about him, a quiet restraint, a sadness in his posture, pulled at the places she'd buried deep. The piano stopped. The room went quiet for a breath too long. It wasn't often that a stranger could silence the whole of Redstone's rowdiest saloon. But this man did. He didn't speak again, didn't smile, just stared into the whiskey like it might hold answers. Clara found herself studying him when she shouldn't, the faint scar on his jaw, the way his shoulders tensed at sudden laughter, the tattoo near his wrist, half hidden by dust and leather. Something in her chest tightened and she hated it. She'd learned long ago that men like him came with ghosts. They always did. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the dry scent of sage and desert. The door creaked open again, and a pair of locals stumbled in, arguing over a card game gone wrong. One of them noticed the stranger and muttered something about bounty posters. Clara's stomach turned cold. She kept her eyes down, polishing the same glass again, but her ears caught every word. The name didn't reach her. Only fragments. Outlaw, reward, dangerous. The stranger lifted his gaze then, and for the first time Clara saw the color of his eyes. Grey, storm-tossed, unreadable. There was no denial in them, no fear either. Just a tired acceptance, like a man who'd already stopped running long before he stepped into this saloon. He finished his drink in one long swallow. His voice came quieter now, almost gentle. "You got a place around here a man can lay low for a while?" Clara hesitated. The smart thing would have been to shake her head, send him on his way, pretend she hadn't heard. But something reckless, something that felt a lot like fate, made her nod instead. "There's a room out back. Ain't much, but it's quiet." He placed a few coins on the counter, more than enough to pay. His hand brushed hers, and in that fleeting touch a spark passed between them. Not fire, just warmth, the kind that could melt the edges of a long, cold night. As she led him through the narrow hall toward the small room behind the saloon, Clara couldn't help but wonder who he really was. His boots left prints in the dust like a trail of questions. When he set his hat on the table, she caught the faintest glimpse of a name carved into the leather band. Jesse Thorn. The name rang familiar, but she couldn't place it. Maybe from a rumor, a wanted poster, a whisper carried by some traveler who passed through weeks ago. Jesse thanked her with a nod, his voice low enough to barely reach her. There was a softness in it that didn't match the danger that clung to him. She turned to leave, but his next words made her stop. "You ever get tired of this place?" She froze, because no one ever asked her that. Every night she'd dream of wildflowers she'd never seen, fields stretching far beyond Redstone's endless dust. She'd imagine clean air, soft rain, and a life that didn't smell like whiskey. And yet, she always stayed. Maybe. That was all she said before closing the door behind her. The night dragged on, quiet except for the faint creak of the windmill outside and the low hum of her thoughts. She didn't know yet that by morning her life would no longer belong to Redstone, because Jesse Thorn's past had just arrived at the edge of town, and it was coming with guns, guilt, and a truth that would tear open the scars she'd tried so hard to hide. The desert slept uneasy that night. Even the wind seemed to whisper secrets along the wooden boards of Redstone's crooked saloon. Clara Mae Hollis sat at the bar long after the lamps dimmed, running her thumb along the rim of an empty glass, thinking about the stranger who now slept just a few steps away, Jesse Thorn. The name rolled through her thoughts like a tumbleweed she couldn't stop chasing. She'd told herself it was foolishness, a saloon girl with too much curiosity and not enough sense. Men like him didn't bring peace. They carried storms behind them. And yet something about that quiet voice, that lost look in his eyes, had burrowed deep inside her. She rose before dawn, the pale light spilling through cracked shutters, dust swirling in gold threads. She brewed coffee, the strong kind that could wake the dead, and carried a cup toward the back room. She hesitated outside his door, fingers hovering above the wood. A low murmur came from inside. Not words, just the restless sound of someone caught in a dream they didn't want. When she finally knocked, the noise stopped. The door opened a second later. Jesse stood there, shirt half-buttoned, gun belt hanging loose on the chair behind him. His eyes were darker this morning, heavy with the kind of weariness that came from years of running. But he smiled barely. A tired man's smile, coffee. Thought you might need it. She handed him the cup and their fingers brushed again. Too brief to mean anything. Too warm to mean nothing. He thanked her and stepped outside into the narrow alley where the light spilled across his shoulders. She followed without asking why. They stood in silence for a while, watching the sky blush pink over the canyon's edge. "You ever think the world gets tired of us?" she said at last. He looked at her. A soft laugh caught in his throat. "Maybe. Or maybe it just keeps spinning till we learn how to keep up." Clara turned away before he could see the small, reluctant smile tugging at her lips. They spent the morning like strangers who weren't quite strangers, talking about nothing, pretending the world beyond Redstone didn't exist. But the world always had a way of finding its way back. By midday, the sheriff's horse rode into town. Sheriff Albie Crane was a broad man, with a moustache thick enough to hide half his lies. He swaggered when he walked, the kind of lawman who liked being feared more than being fair. When he pushed through the saloon doors, everyone straightened up. Clara's stomach tightened. "Morning, Miss Hollis," he said, with a smile that never reached his eyes. "You seen anyone new in town lately?" Her heart skipped once. She kept her hands steady on the counter. "Redstone's always got new faces, Sheriff. Any reason you're asking?" Crane tapped the bounty poster he carried in one hand. A familiar face stared up at her from the paper. The ink faded, but the eyes unmistakable. Jesse Thorn. Wanted. Armed and dangerous. Reward 500, and Clara's blood ran cold. She forced her voice not to tremble. "Can't say I've seen him." The sheriff studied her a moment longer as if sniffing out the lie, then tipped his hat. "Well, if you do, best tell me quick. A man like that don't walk free for long." When he left, the room filled again with sound, laughter too loud, cards slapping against tables. But Clara couldn't hear any of it. She walked to the back hall, her boots quiet on the wood, and pushed open Jesse's door. He was gone. The bed untouched, the window open. A gust of wind swept through, tossing the curtains like pale ghosts. Outside, she found him saddling his horse behind the saloon, every motion deliberate, careful. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't turn. "Sheriff's sniffing around. I don't aim to bring trouble to your door." Clara crossed her arms, fighting the sting in her chest. "What did you do, Jesse Thorn?" He paused, his hand tightening on the reins. "Depends who you ask. Some'd say I robbed a train. Others'd say I saved a woman from a man who deserved killing. Both might be true," her heart twisted. "So which are you? A hero or a murderer?" He looked at her then, really looked, his grey eyes catching the light like silver dust. A man who's tired of being called either. She wanted to tell him to stay, that the world could be cruel and lonely, but maybe less so if they faced it together. But the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she said softly, "If you ride east, take the canyon trail. Sheriff won't think to look there." He gave a small nod, the ghost of gratitude in his eyes. Then, before swinging onto his horse, he reached into his coat and placed something on the rail between them. A small, pressed wildflower, faded but still holding its color. Found it near the border a while back, he said. Reminded me not everything beautiful dies in the dust. And then he rode off. Clara stood there long after he vanished into the desert haze, fingers curled around the fragile stem. She told herself it was just another passing drifter. Just another man with too many secrets. But when night fell and the wind carried the faint echo of hooves in the distance, her heart whispered otherwise, because in that single day, Jesse Thorn had stirred something she thought long dead, a piece of her that still believed in more than survival. And by the time the sheriff returned the next evening, dragging 2 deputies and questions she didn't want to answer, Clara realized that no matter how far Jesse rode, his story had already tangled with hers. She didn't know yet that the wildflower he'd left behind wasn't just a token, it was a warning. And by the time it wilted, Redstone would burn. The wind carried the scent of smoke before the fire ever reached Redstone. It came low through the canyon, twisting like something alive, curling around the rooftops until even the horses grew restless. By the time Clara Mae stepped out from the saloon that night, the horizon glowed an eerie orange, the desert breathing fire. She thought first of Jesse Thorn, and then she hated herself for it. She told herself it wasn't her concern what became of him. He'd chosen his road and it didn't run alongside hers. But when she saw the sheriff's men riding hard through the dust, torches in hand, she knew what kind of justice they were after. Crane wasn't chasing law, he was chasing revenge. By dawn, the word spread fast. The Thorn gang, the men Jesse had once ridden with, had been cornered at a burned-out ranch 20 miles east. Only one had escaped. The others lay dead among the ashes. Clara didn't need anyone to say his name. She knew. That evening she sat behind the saloon with the wilted wildflower still pressed between her fingers. It had turned the color of old parchment, its petals fragile as breath. She wondered if Jesse was alive, if he remembered her, if he regretted leaving that morning with the sun on his back and her silence at his heels. She thought she'd buried her hope, but hope was a stubborn weed. It grew through the cracks no matter how much dust you piled on top. She was still sitting there when she heard it, the slow, uneven clop of hooves. Her heart froze. She rose, wiping her hands on her skirt. A horse came through the misted light, stumbling, foam on its bit. And slumped across its back, blood staining his sleeve, was Jesse Thorn. Clara ran before she could think. He slid from the saddle, catching himself against the fence with one shaking hand. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. He tried to smile, but pain cut through it. Didn't have nowhere else to go. She helped him inside, the saloon now empty and dark. She laid him across the backroom bed, the same one she'd offered days ago. His blood soaked through the sheets as she tore her apron into strips to bind the wound near his ribs. "It's not bad," he murmured. "You're a terrible liar." He tried to laugh but coughed instead. The sound tore something inside her. When the bleeding slowed, she sat beside him, her fingers trembling as they brushed the hair from his forehead. The heat of him frightened her. Alive, burning, too real. "You should have kept riding," she said. "And miss your coffee." She looked at him then. Really looked. And all the walls she'd built over the years cracked just a little. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains. A storm was coming, heavy and mean. Jesse stirred. "Crane knows I came back. He'll come for you too." "Let him," she whispered. "Clara, no, you listen to me now. I have spent half my life hiding from something. My past, my feelings, hell, even the sunrise some days. You think I'm going to start running now?" His breath hitched. "Why are you helping me?" She smiled faintly. "Maybe because I'm tired of watching things die thirsty." He looked at her a long time, the rain beginning to drum against the window, the sound filling the silence between them. Then, slow as a confession, he reached for her hand. Their fingers met in the dim light, and the storm outside broke wide open. They didn't speak after that. There were no promises, no vows, no need for either. The air between them said everything. The kind of love that wasn't soft or gentle, but desperate, human, born from loneliness and fire. When the morning came, the rain had stopped. The desert smelled new, clean. But Redstone didn't wake to peace. The sheriff was back. Crane's boots thundered through the saloon before Clara could hide Jesse. His voice barked orders. His men searching every corner, the scrape of guns against wood echoing like thunder. When he found her standing near the bar, his eyes narrowed. "You look nervous, Miss Hollis. Something you want to tell me?" She met his stare, calm and sharp as glass. "Only that you ought to get out before the storm hits again." He laughed. "I ain't afraid of no weather." "No," she said softly. "I didn't mean that kind." Behind her, a door creaked open. Jesse stepped out of the back room, pale but standing, gun in hand. The room froze. Crane's smirk vanished. "Thorn should have stayed dead, maybe," Jesse said. "But I still got one thing left to finish." The world held its breath. A single gunshot shattered the stillness. When the smoke cleared, Crane lay on the floor, his badge gleaming beside his fallen hand. Jesse's gun clattered to the wood. Clara stood frozen, the echo still ringing in her chest. It was over. But nothing about it felt like an ending. Jesse looked at her, his voice breaking. "He was gonna hurt you." She crossed the space between them and pressed her forehead to his chest, tears hot against his skin. "I know." Outside, the clouds broke apart, sunlight bleeding through. The storm was done, but the wind still carried the scent of wildflowers, faint and sweet through the open door. And as Jesse held her there in the fading light, Clara realized that maybe love wasn't meant to save anyone. Maybe it was just meant to make the pain worth something. The sun rose slow and red over Redstone, the kind of dawn that made the desert look like it was bleeding. The smoke from the sheriff's gun still lingered in the air, curling against the rafters as if the saloon itself was trying to breathe. Clara Mae Hollis sat on the floor beside Jesse Thorn, her hands trembling, though she'd long stopped crying. Sheriff Crane's body lay where it had fallen, his badge catching the first light of morning like a cruel kind of mercy. Jesse's face was pale, sweat beading along his brow. The wound he'd taken before was open again, blood seeping through the makeshift bandages. "We have to go," Clara whispered. Jesse's voice came rough, distant. "There's no running left, darling. Not after this," she shook her head. "Then we make one last run, together." He looked at her, and for a heartbeat, she saw the boy he must have been once, the one who hadn't learned yet how heavy a gun could make your soul. "All right," he said. Together, they buried Crane at the edge of town, quick and quiet. No one came to stop them. No one dared. The people of Redstone watched from behind shutters, afraid to look too long, afraid to care too much. By the time the sun was high, Jesse and Clara were already on horseback, riding north. The air shimmered with heat, the land stretching endless and unforgiving. The first night they camped beneath a sky so full of stars, it looked like heaven had cracked open. Jesse sat by the fire, cleaning his gun, though they both knew he was too weak to fight. Clara watched him, her heart caught somewhere between fear and love. "You ever think we could have met different?" she asked softly. He glanced up. "Maybe in another life. Maybe I'd have walked into your saloon with clean hands." She smiled, sad and small. "I don't think I'd have trusted you then." He laughed, a sound raw from disuse. "Guess we're damned either way." When the fire burned low, she crawled close beside him, her head resting against his shoulder. The desert wind sighed through the sagebrush like an old lullaby. "You sleep," he murmured. "I'll keep watch," but she didn't sleep. She lay awake listening to his heartbeat, slow and uneven, like the ticking of a clock winding down. By morning, the trail grew rough. Jesse's wound opened again, and each mile carved more color from his face. Clara tore her skirt for new bandages, whispered curses and prayers alike, and kept him steady in the saddle. When they reached the ridge overlooking the valley, Jesse stopped his horse and stared out. Below them stretched miles of green, wildflowers blooming after the storm, painting the land in colors Clara had only dreamed of. "I told you not everything beautiful dies in the dust," Jesse said, a faint smile on his lips. Tears stung her eyes. "You're going to see it again, Jesse. I'll make sure of it." He didn't answer. His gaze drifted to the horizon, and she saw the light leaving him slowly, like the sun slipping behind a hill. "Don't you dare," she whispered. "Don't you leave me here." He turned to her then, his hand finding hers, their fingers laced tight. "Clara Mae Hollis, you made a sinner. Remember what mercy feels like." And before she could answer, his body went still. She sat there a long time, the wind tangling her hair, her tears falling onto the wildflowers below. When she finally moved, it was slow, deliberate. She laid him down beneath a patch of blue blossoms, the earth soft from the storm. With trembling hands, she took the pressed wildflower he'd once given her and placed it on his chest. Then she kissed him, soft, trembling, a promise left behind. By dusk, she rode alone, the sky bruised and gold. Redstone was gone behind her. Jesse gone beneath her heart. And ahead lay a world she no longer feared. She didn't look back. But if anyone had been watching from the ridge that night, they might have sworn the wind carried two silhouettes, one woman riding steady through the fading light, and one shadow riding beside her, just close enough to keep her safe. The desert was quiet again. Too quiet. The kind that only comes after something sacred has been broken. Clara Mae Hollis rode through the fading heat of afternoon, her horse tired, her heart heavier than the saddle she carried. The world looked different now, softer somehow, though everything she loved was gone. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, not the trail behind her. The ridge where she'd laid Jesse Thorn to rest still lingered in her mind, his name echoing in the rhythm of her horse's hooves. Each step was a heartbeat she could no longer hear but still felt. There was no plan, no destination, just distance. She followed it like it might lead her somewhere his memory couldn't follow, though she already knew better. Love like that doesn't fade with miles. It lingers like the scent of rain after fire. She reached a small town 3 days later, a place called Hollow Bend, quiet and forgotten by the maps. It had a single church, a dusty main street, and a small inn run by a widow with kind eyes. Clara rented a room upstairs and said little about where she'd come from. She unpacked only one thing from her bag, the empty whiskey bottle Jesse had left behind. Washed clean, the wildflower pressed inside it like a secret that still breathed. At night, she'd set it by the window and watch the moonlight slip through it, turning the faded petals gold again. Some nights she swore she could still hear his voice in the wind, low, teasing, warm. "You sleep, Clara, I'll keep watch. But dreams don't protect you. They just remind you what you've lost." One morning the widow knocked at her door. A man had come through town, dusty, scarred, and carrying a story about a saloon girl from Redstone and the outlaw she saved. He'd heard the sheriff was dead. He'd heard the outlaw too. But he said no one ever found the woman. Clara smiled faintly. "Guess she found her own way," the widow nodded. "He left this, said you might want it." She handed over a folded paper, creased, smudged with dirt. It was a drawing, rough but careful, of a woman standing in a field of wildflowers, her hair unpinned and the wind in her eyes. At the bottom, scrawled in a shaky hand, was a single line, "If the dust settles, meet me where the river bends." Her breath caught. She stared at it for a long time, the words ghosting through her fingers. It wasn't possible. Jesse was gone. She'd buried him herself, felt the stillness in him, the cold that followed the final breath. And yet, that night she saddled her horse again. The moon hung low, heavy as regret, as she rode north toward the canyon. The world was silver and silent, every sound amplified by the hush of the land. When she reached the bend in the river, dawn was just breaking. The air smelled of sage and rain. She dismounted slowly, her boots sinking into soft earth. The valley stretched out before her, wildflowers blooming thick, their colors spilling like paint across the dirt. It looked almost holy, and there near the water's edge was a small wooden cross. Her chest tightened. She dropped to her knees beside it. There was no name carved, but she didn't need one. She traced the wood with trembling fingers, whispering his name like a prayer. Jesse Thorn. Something in the wind shifted. The world went still. Then, just faintly, she heard it, the sound of hooves, distant but steady, moving across the canyon floor. She looked up, but there was no one there. Only the wind weaving through the flowers, bending them gently toward her. She smiled through her tears. "I know," she whispered. "You kept watch." She reached into her satchel and pulled out the bottle with the pressed flower inside. She uncorked it and let the fragile petals fall into the river. The water caught them, carried them downstream, turning gold in the light. And for the first time in years, Clara didn't feel alone. When she rode back toward Hollow Bend, she didn't look behind her. She didn't have to. The land was quiet, peaceful, and full of things that had once seemed impossible, wildflowers blooming through dust, and the faint promise of love that refused to die. The story of Redstone faded with time, whispered only in saloons and campfires. Some said the outlaw and the saloon girl were ghosts. Others said they'd found a valley where the sun never burned too hot, and the night stayed soft. But those who passed through the northern trail sometimes spoke of a woman who rode alone, her hair loose, her eyes bright, a faint smile on her lips, and beside her, just for a heartbeat, the shimmer of a rider made of light and dust, watching her like he'd promised he always would. And somewhere in the wind, her name carried still Clara Mae Hollis, the woman who kissed an outlaw, buried her fear, and taught the desert to bloom.